Mr. Wise, thank you for being in this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Why Vladimir Putin say that the war in Ukraine is becoming, it has a global character?
I mean, if you adopt his perspective, of course, you'd say, well, you have the United States, Britain, France, and other European and Western countries supporting Ukraine's war effort, fighting back against the illegal aggression by Russia. Now, what is interesting, of course, when he talks about it's becoming a global war, well, it's rather he who has now support by North Korean forces. More than 10,000 North Korean soldiers are now fighting on the side of the Russians. So when it comes to globalizing the conflict, well, he's making a rather good effort.
How is the war in Ukraine escalating to an international conflict?
You have the European powers plus other NATO powers, especially the United States, supporting Ukraine, which makes it an international conflict. However, on the side of the Russians, now, as I mentioned already, you have North Korean troops fighting on the side of the Russians. Russia already for a while now receives North Korean arms and ammunition, and of course also now is being delivered with Iranian weapons. And then at the end of the day, let's not forget the reason why Russia can ultimately sustain its war effort is because of not arms, but dual use items and other economic support it receives from China. And finally, countries such as India, they buy huge amounts of Russian oil, of course, which maintains the Russian economy. Despite all sanctions, therefore, Putin can keep going.
What do you think is happening there?
The Western powers, especially the United States, were quite hesitant to authorize Ukraine to use these weapons to target, military targets inside Russia, because they were expecting potential escalation from Putin's side. Now, this is what happened. Of course, Putin thought he had to respond. Even though, of course, the escalation is not that dramatic, it undermines his war effort that these weapons can be used inside Russia now. And he had also to send a signal vis-à-vis the Russian population. He had to show that he's doing something in response. He has also to try to destabilize already shaky Western support to Ukraine, and of course, sending a signal to the United States, because amongst the Trump supporters, a lot of people think that the support to Ukraine might lead to a major escalation involving the United States, if not World War III.
Why are Ukraine and Russia interchanging missiles?
From the Ukrainian side, the missiles have been used to weaken the Russian supply chains offensive, so that actually they would not be able to make further progress in the east and regain more territory that Ukraine's taken in Kursk, in the Kursk region. But on the other hand, what Putin did, so he was not going for a particularly important target. This was a show of strength. He wanted actually to show that he was willing to escalate to a certain degree in order to make the Western powers back down, and therefore also have potentially a more solid position to deal from when Trump comes to power, who wants to supposedly, according to his arguments, end the war.
What do you think about all of this?
Russia, sadly, despite all of Russian greatness, great culture and everything, it is a corrupt kind of mafia state ruled to a large extent by the KGB that does not respect human rights, democratic rights, that's cracking down on its own population. So it was trying to regain momentum to some extent by attacking Ukraine. It still sees the so-called post-Soviet space as its own space, its sphere of influence. So ultimately, the responsibility lies with Putin, even though, of course, there are a number of factors that help explaining it. And that does not absolve Ukraine, or I'm not saying in any way that Ukraine is a perfect country. Ukraine before the war was a dramatically corrupt country, dysfunctional in many ways. But in this particular case, sadly, Russia launched a military attack after years, also, it must be said, of hybrid and gray zone warfare trying to weaken Ukraine already.
What do you think is going to happen in this conflict, the war?
If it's not escalating completely and making it international in a way that it's truly international with other troop involvement from other countries, then I think ultimately the two conflict parties, with substantial pressure from other powers, will reach a peace deal or at least an armistice. Probably not a peace deal, but an armistice, because both sides ultimately they're not really in a position to afford this conflict going on for much longer. It also has not been a war of movement now for quite a while. The territorial gains are minimal. They're losing, both sides have huge casualties. So there's no common sense to carry on. The problem is, of course, that after a significant amount of sacrifice and losses, a lot of Ukrainians are not willing to give up territory. Putin is not willing to actually not get more territory.
That's it, Mr. Wise. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.